Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bachelor Society talk, which is to, theoretically at least, take place on the 29th of September. So it's Tuesday of week A. Ideally, you'd be listening to this at about 1:30, but don't worry if you're not. You can play it on catch up. Now, for historians, this concept of time, listening to something at 1:30 or it being a Tuesday, is actually pretty significant, as one would expect. The study of history has thankfully now moved away from a list of dates and events. Someone shouts a date and someone shouts back, "Oh, it's the Battle of Bannockburn." That kind of thing is gone now. Equally, however, the opposite end of the scale, which involves just studying a period of history in total isolation from any sort of meaningful chronological framework, that's also something to be avoided. However, at various moments in history, and this is getting to the gist of today's talk, states have attempted to reinterpret how time itself is measured, usually after a revolution or significant change in government. Now, there is some logic, perhaps, in thinking about different ways of ordering time, if only because the current system is somewhat unusual. Aside from the fact that 12 is a nicely divisible number, being divisible by 2, 3, 4, and 6, there's no real reason for having 12 months in the year. 60, which is obviously a multiple of 12, is a similarly arbitrary number for minutes in an hour or seconds in a minute. 24 hours in a day is also not necessarily a logical step. It is there presumably because 12 and 12 again are 24. But why 24? Why not measure something in 25? I'm not saying make the day longer, I'm just saying measure time differently so 25 units fit into a space currently occupied by 24. If you're very interested, the 24, I think, derives from an ancient Babylonian system whereby you counted each passing hour on a knuckle, but didn't include the thumbs for some reason. So you have 4 fingers, which is 8 because you've got 2 hands, and then 3 knuckles on each finger. And that's 24, but I'm not certain why you didn't count thumbs, so that can't explain that, and I'm not even certain whether I am actually accurate on this and whether we're potentially just wandering through a dream I had where ancient Babylonians ticked things off on their fingers. So anyway, what we're going to be talking about today is the efforts by governments to amend the way time in which the way in which time is measured. This is not the same as when governments, such as the Commonwealth of England did under Cromwell or the Bolsheviks did in Russia, where they simply say we're moving to a different location on the same chronological line. So, for instance, you're probably familiar with the fact that depending on whether you use the Julian or the Gregorian calendar, the February and November revolutions were not necessarily in February and November. In England, the government of Cromwell decided to advance the date by 10 days, but they still kept, crucially, the same way of measuring time. They just simply moved where the nation was on it. Instead, I'm looking at efforts to break entirely with a system of arbitrarily defined time measurements. You can't change a day, how long it is, you can't change a season, you can't change a solar year, but all other units can be altered from seconds up to months. There are numerous examples of this throughout history, ranging from the introduction of Year Zero in Cambodia in 1975 to a brief declaration shortly after World War II in Germany of something I think was called a Stunde Null. But no experiment in time demarcation has lasted, or did last, as long as the efforts of the First French Republic, which were based around a fundamental desire to demonarchize and undeify time. Their experiment in doing so lasted from 1794 to 1805. Now, under what was simply known at the time as the Republican calendar, but is now become known as the French Revolutionary calendar, 2 large-scale changes were brought in. Firstly, time was to be decimalised. So we have here the execution of the king, and it was held that with the king's death, the theory was that we should now move quickly to, or France should now move quickly to an era where the monarchy had absolutely no influence whatsoever. And clearly one of the things that the monarch had done was observe 24-hour time. So that was going to change. Unusually, a woman seems to be carrying a large oxygen tank in this picture. I don't know what that's about. It's not going to help him. He is going to be guillotined. Anyway, time was decimalised. So here we have a decimal clock. 100 seconds went into every minute, and 100 minutes went into every hour, and 10 hours went into every day. The change might seem very unusual to us, but actually it wasn't particularly surprising. For all that it seems strange now, the Republic was doing a great deal of standardisation at the time. Weights and measurements, for instance, were decimalised, and the metric system, which it brought in, is pretty durable. However, time didn't really measure up in this sense, because unfortunately there's an element of confusion about what constituted a new second and a new minute and so on. If you wanted to measure one of the new distances, say you wanted to measure a metre, then that was possible, because you would easily have access to some sort of measuring stick. Obviously not a yard stick, but a metre stick, or something with centimetres marked onto it. So you could very quickly translate from the old system of measurement to the new system of measurement. However, in order to do this with time, you obviously needed one of these. You needed a decimal clock. And what we're talking about here is a society at the very beginning of an industrial revolution. It's never going to be able to mass produce enough clocks in enough time to help the new system bed in. Nor did the new system particularly lend itself to easy conversion. A second ended up being ever so slightly shorter than a regular second, but a minute ended up being ever so slightly longer than a regular minute, because there's more of the shorter seconds. So it was very difficult to quickly convert. So even today, people are capable in the UK of holding in their minds, units of measurement which aren't totally compatible, inches and centimetres. But everyone's happy with the concept that an inch is 2.5 centimetres, and everyone knows that a foot is 30 centimetres. We can do that because it's quite easy. But the idea of converting decimal time into regular time was very, very difficult without such aids, and they weren't able to provide them. Additionally, any unit above an hour needed treating differently, because obviously, whilst you can say, well, the day's now got 10 hours in it, you can't make the day physically longer than it is. The sun will rise and the sun will set when it does, irrespective of what laws a government passes. So what tended to happen was that weeks became decimalised, and there were 10 days in a week, and then 3 weeks made a month. And the reason for this was because of one of these things that you can't change. You can't change the fact that the Earth orbits the Sun once every 365 days. So even though you'd really like to have presumably 10 months in a year, you can't actually do that, because your year will end about 1/6 earlier than it should have done. So you could make a year having 10 months, 100 months, or 1,000 weeks, or whatever, but you'd quickly lose any semblance to the actual seasons. So they had to adjust the system slightly, and they said, okay, we're going to keep 12 months. So already decimalisation is gone, but each month's only going to be 30 days long, because we've got decimal weeks. We're going to fit 3 of them in. And that's what you ended up with. You had the first month of the year was Vendémiaire, then you had Brumaire, Frimaire, Nivoise, Plouvoise, Ventose, and all the ones on the bottom row, which I'm sure that you can read. Anyway, this gives you 36 weeks of 10 days each, which gives you 360 days, but you'll notice here that the problem is that 360 isn't the same as 365, or indeed 366, should it be a leap year. So it was necessary to add in bank holidays. 5 of them, 6 in a leap year, which were known as Sansculottides, which were named after the workers on whom apparently the bedrock of the revolution was constructed. So from the beginning, it was always a very clunky match. You had your nice decimalised minutes and seconds and hours, which fitted perfectly, if a bit unusually, into the unit of the day. But then you couldn't really abandon the older systems. Obviously, you've changed the names. You've ditched the reference to Roman gods and emperors like Augustus and Julius and Mars and all the rest of it. But you've still got 12, and 12 and 10 aren't perfectly compatible numbers, obviously. Now, the second change that came in along with decimalised time was that, as you can see here, all of the months' names were changed. So days, months and years were all considered to be too heavily tainted by Catholicism and the monarchy. Years are the obvious ones. They stem, from year zero being the approximate year, at least, of Christ's birth. So they needed to restart the years, and 1792 became year one. Unfortunately, in 1792, the French revolutionaries were pretty busy having a revolution, and they'd not actually thought about changing the year, nor did they think about it in 1793, when they were also pretty busy. It was only in 1794 that someone sort of got round to saying, maybe this year thing, maybe this needs changing. So even though when you lived through 1792 and 1793, you called it 1792 and 1793, you ended up having to retrospectively change this to year one and year two during year three, which was 1794. The names of the months pretty straightforward. I don't know how many of you listening do French, but you should be able to recognise, sort of stems of various words in here. So Vendôme is the windy month, and Brumaire is the foggy month, and you've got a rainy month and a cold month and a snowy month and all the rest of it. Is Ventos the windy month and Vendôme not the windy month? Oh, I don't know. Let's go and ask the French department. There's a hot month, Thermidor. There's a month of meadows and a month of germinating seeds and all the rest of it. At any rate, these things at least can't be confused with anything religious, because they're derived from nature. However, to create an extra element of confusion, they decided that the first day of the new system, which was going to be called the 1st of Vendômiaire in year one, was not actually to approximate to any existing month. So instead of saying the 1st of October has become the 1st of Vendômiaire, they decreed that the 1st of Vendômiaire was the old 22nd of September 1792. Which meant that you couldn't just translate stuff across. You couldn't even go in stages. You couldn't take your birthday as being in October and say, well, it's now in Brumaire, or you take it in January and say, well, it's now in Nivoise. You actually had to work out the entire thing again. Impressively, they also sought, and I know you can't see this very well, they also sought to replace the concept of saints' days. Now, saints' days are, or were, a significant part of Catholic theory, and they celebrated the births or significant achievements on certain days of particular Catholic saints. So, I mean, there's an obvious one, St. Valentine's Day is the 14th of February. You'll be aware of St. Andrew's Day, St. David's Day, St. Patrick's Day. But you've got to imagine that that's happening pretty much on a day-by-day basis. There's an awful lot of saints in the Catholic Church, and they all get commemorated by something which happens on a particular day. So the Republic sought to replace these saints' days with what they called the days of the real treasures, rather than the days of the charlatans. The real treasures were, in the eyes of the Republic at the time, elements such as iron or gold, vegetables, fruits, meats, types of animals, plants, and peasant tools and accessories. Now, this wasn't an immediate problem, but it did lead to certain issues, because there is perhaps a certain glory, although not being religious, I can't say I'm aware of this fully, in perhaps sharing, the feast day or saint's day of a particular saint. Because after all, this saint, in theory, gives you somebody to look up to, somebody to emulate. If nothing else, it's an interesting story, and you learn about their lives and you develop an interest. It's probably difficult to get quite as excited about the fact that you share your day with an arbitrarily decided vegetable. To give just a couple of examples, if you happened to have been born on the 20th of January, under the old system, of course, then you were born on the feast day of Saint Sebastian. And St. Sebastian, although his deeds during life probably aren't that well known, his martyrdom, where he's sort of shot full of arrows, is a significant, memorable event. Under the new system, you were, instead of allowed to be getting excited about St. Sebastian, you had to get excited about spurge laurel, which is a type of plant. And before anyone says, well, plants are kind of useful, this particular plant is now viewed as an invasive weed and is highly poisonous. Alternatively, St Andrew's Day, 30th of November, is, under the revolutionary calendar, the day on which you celebrate the use of the pickaxe, and the 14th of October was simply Aubergine Day. So, unsurprisingly, this didn't catch on. In short, there were quite a lot of issues with this new system. But the fact that it was introduced during the Terror, which was a period of time in which the revolutionary government were guillotining numerous individuals, meant that non-compliance with the calendar was never likely to be a serious issue. France struggled on with it until 1805, when Napoleon decreed that they would return to the old system. Curiously, the reasons which Napoleon gave for returning to the what we might term the Christian calendar were not exactly the ones which you might have thought. He didn't say anything about, no one can get excited about an aubergine or anything like that. He didn't even say, look, we all understand and appreciate the old system, so we're just going to go back to something which everybody knows about. He raised instead 4 different reasons, or rather he raised 3 different reasons, and I think there was a 4th one, which you don't have to look very hard to find. The first point is that, as alluded to earlier, it's difficult to become familiar with the amount of time that a second, minute or hour actually take in the decimal system, because there's no metronome or no pendulum clock which can measure your own timekeeping up against the required standard. Secondly, although the calendar was supposed to idolise the sans-culottes by their introduction of the Saint-Culottide bank holidays, the working man and woman actually did worse off out of the new system than they did out of the old, because under the old system, a 7-day week gave you a day off in every 7. But the decimal week only gave you a day off in every 10. Thirdly, by 1805, France had conquered numerous European nations, and these nations heavily resented not just the French occupation, but obviously as well the concept of having to adjust to French time measurements. Napoleon needed their goodwill, because with their goodwill it was easier to gain their resources and their manpower. So he argued that he had little choice but to adopt a more universally recognised system. The 4th reason is in this photograph. This is a painting, pretty sure. It's what they used to do before they had camera phones. This painting shows the coronation of Napoleon. He has got the crown in his own hands and he's about to place it on his own head. The notion of getting rid of supreme autocrats is therefore probably not something which Napoleon really wants to push. He's about to be an emperor. Does he want to get rid of a system which commemorates emperors through the months of, for instance, July and August? The setting in which this scene is occurring is Notre Dame Cathedral. Getting rid of religion is therefore no longer paramount in the mind of the French government either. So in other words, the regimes had gone full circle. Napoleon was much happier to adopt the mentality of the monarchists than he was to adopt the mentality of the republicans. So, given that this is happening at the end of 1804, one of the first things he does is he says it's not a requirement anymore to steer clear of hereditary autocracies or religious convention, and in 1805 the experiment was abandoned. It lingered on in 1 or 2 different ways. Émile Zola wrote a novel called Germinal, which is after one of the revolutionary months. And apparently the French Navy has a whole class of frigate which celebrates all the other months of the revolutionary calendar. There's the dish Lobster Thermidor, which doesn't come directly from this, but from a play of 1891, which is set during the revolutionary month of Thermidor. And during the siege of Paris in the 1870s, a decision was made by the Paris Commune to readopt the revolutionary calendar, though it actually only lasted a few weeks. I think it only lasted a couple of weeks, in fact. It may have been a bit more than that. In summary, the French Republic lacked the power, as does any government, to increase or decrease the orbital speed of the Earth's rotation, and that meant that any attempt to make time more logical was simply never going to succeed. Whilst the revolutionary calendar from 1792/4 to 1805 seems to have been the longest and most successful attempt to redefine the framework of chronology, it was ultimately unable to compete with physical realities. The notion of time as a propaganda unit, however, was brought into the mainstream for the first time here. Now, obviously, Britain never adopted the concept of revolutionary time, but this notion that time itself can pass on some sort of historical message is possibly at the root of certain other historical attempts that we've seen in the recent past to time things in certain ways. So this concept that you have a framework of what should we say, a framework of a chronological narrative allows governments to act in manners which help to persuade the participants of that state that the government is acting in their own best interests. We could, for instance, talk about an email which came out on the first day after the terror attacks in 2001, which said, look, if you've got any bad news, release it today because no one's going to be interested. So the concept of bringing time into government control, although it didn't happen wonderfully because of the French Revolutionary Calendar, is still something which sort of begun with the French Revolutionary Calendar. And the idea that timing can be important, I think, could potentially trace itself back to this era, although it is difficult to say. It's most interesting now, the phenomenon of the French Revolutionary Calendar is most interesting now when one is researching family trees or family history, because it's quite fun. You get back to about sort of 1820 and you're looking for a birth certificate of someone who's born in the late 1790s, and then suddenly it pops up that they were born in year 6 in Floréal on the 30th day of Floréal, and that's also the day of the beef tomato, so you should be very happy with that. It's quite fun, but it is really an anachronistic footnote to history. They're nevertheless quite an interesting one to explore, and there are numerous websites which will tell you, what your birthday is in the revolutionary calendar, or indeed what day we are on today. I think we're in Vendémiaire, because if the first day is Vendémiaire of first Vendémiaire is the 22nd of September. I'm recording this on, you're listening to this on the 29th, so what are we today? Presumably the 8th of Vendémiaire in year 230. That's an interesting way of looking at things. Thank you very much. Hope to see you virtually next time around. Yes, see what I did there. Very good. Thank you. Goodbye.